This is a much easier speech, I think, about driving, learning to drive in Finland. Okay, so I don't think there's any technical vocab at all, probably. No, probably not. Ladies and gentlemen, I was watching the news on French telly the other day, and according to the statistics, the figures for road deaths in France have fallen significantly since the early 1970s. So forgive me, this is off the top of my head, but in the early 70s there were about 17,500 deaths on the roads every year, and the death toll last year in France was 3,500. So basically there has been a fourfold decrease in that time in France. You can attribute this to a number of factors. It could be to do with how you deal with the road infrastructure, for example, installing safety barriers on some roads, or installing speed cameras so that people don't drive so fast. It can also be to do with awareness-raising campaigns of the dangers either of speeding or of drink driving. Or it could be to do with the way that France trains young drivers to drive and the way that the driving test is designed. And it has to be said that the driving test varies significantly, in my experience, from country to country in Europe. I can't say much about other countries. I have certainly visited countries where it seemed to me that there was no driving test at all, and where every time I got into a car I was taking my life into my own hands, or the hands of my driver. For example, in India, where we drove along roads and every so often there would be a pothole so massive that the driver would simply go across to the other side of the road, regardless of whether something was coming the other way. A water buffalo, for example. However, to come back to Europe, for a long time I thought that the reason that Belgian drivers, forgive me for the cliches here, struck me as being particularly bad was because I was told that before the 80s or before the 70s there was no driving test at all in Belgium, and therefore there was a whole generation of older drivers who hadn't had to pass a test to be out there on the roads, which struck me as foolhardy and reckless. But that can't in fact be the explanation of why I find Belgian drivers, aggressive and unobservant on the roads compared to British drivers, because when I travel to Italy or to Greece, I also find that the drivers there are aggressive and unobservant compared to British standards. So I don't know, it must be something else. However, since I'm talking about driving tests in general, I was particularly struck to discover recently that the law is going to change in Finland. And from now on, it will be possible for Finnish parents to teach their offspring to drive. So young people who are learning to drive in Finland won't have to take any lessons from a certified driving instructor before passing the test. In the past, I understand that it was possible for Finnish parents to teach their children to drive as long as they had gone through a course of 10 lessons together. So before they could fly free, as it were, without an instructor, they had to go through a certain period of training together. But this is no longer the case. And now, if you are a young person growing up in Finland, you can simply get your parents to teach you to drive, and then you still have to take the test, of course. But basically, it can all stay in the family. There are a number of advantages to this. The major advantage is the amount of money that you can save. Approximately 700 to 1,000 euros. You will no longer be spending that money on driving lessons, although the parents will still have to spend some money on fitting dual controls in the car. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about if you've taken driving lessons yourselves. Dual controls are where the passenger also has a set of pedals so that they can brake if the driver does something rather unexpected and dangerous. And of course you still have fuel costs. If parents are teaching their own children to drive and they have to put in a certain number of hours and miles, then they will be paying for the fuel instead of the driving instructor. So you save some money, but you still have some costs. And I suppose the other major advantage of keeping it in the family is convenience, because you can just use the family car and you can go out and practice whenever you like, as long as one of your parents is available to go with you. However, it seems to me that there are also many disadvantages to learning to drive with your parents. And I'm pretty sure that for me, the disadvantages outweigh the potential advantages. To my mind, it seems to me that even if parents are good drivers themselves, that doesn't necessarily make them good teachers. And I think that teacher-pupil relationship is very much complicated in this situation by the parent-child relationship, so that it can be extremely stressful for a parent to be in a car with their own child trying to teach them to drive, and typically children become very defensive because you're sort of used to being told off by your parents and being criticised by them, and as a teenager you're used to being defensive and rejecting all that criticism. And unfortunately you can't always get away from the roles that you play within a family as soon as you're in a car. So I think it can be very difficult, emotionally speaking, for a parent to teach a child to drive, let alone, by the way, for a spouse or boyfriend or girlfriend to teach their partner to drive. I also think that can be extremely tricky. So it seems to me that this is not necessarily the most productive way to learn to drive. I think sometimes you need an outsider. And that's if the parents are good drivers. I was saying they could be good drivers but not good teachers. What if the parent is a bad driver? They could pass on bad habits to their children. So I'm frankly not very convinced by this new possibility afforded the people of Finland. However, let us not forget that in Finland you still have to pass the driving test. So it doesn't matter how you learned, whether you took 50 hours of driving lessons with a qualified instructor or whether you just went out with your dad every Sunday morning for 2 months, it doesn't matter, you still have to pass the same test. And indeed, that test in Finland is quite demanding. I was interested to see some of the components of the driving test in Finland. There's a theory test, of course, like virtually everywhere now. But you also have to pass part of your test driving in the dark, which I think is a very good thing. The UK test doesn't include that component, and I think it does. It should. Because when I started to drive, I found that driving in the dark was completely different. You can be very distracted by the headlights of cars coming the other way. Or if you're driving on the motorway, it can be very difficult to judge distance between you and other cars when all you can see is the brake lights, the red lights in front of you. So I think there's a skill to driving in the dark. And indeed driving at dusk, when it's harder to make things out as the light disappears. So that's one component of their driving test. And apparently they also have to perform part of their driving test on ice. I guess to be able to deal with winter conditions in Finland, which also strikes me as quite sensible. And that being the case, in the UK, we should really have part of our driving test on very slippery, rainy roads with autumn leaves on them, but we don't. And finally, in Finland, they have to have covered thousands of kilometres over a period of 2 years. I don't have a lot of detail on this, but it sounds to me as though there must be a probation period before you're a fully qualified driver in Finland. So I suppose you could say that in this case, the end justifies the means. If you pass the test, you're okay to drive in Finland, and it really doesn't make any difference whatsoever how you learned. But personally, I think parents are mad if they try to teach their children to drive. I think children are better off learning from a professional. In fact, I think the parents are better off if their children learn from a professional. They'll probably get a more thorough grounding from a qualified driving instructor. And then they can still practice occasionally with their parents, who can pass on valuable tips about driving in real life conditions, if you like. Thank you.